So it's tonight we're going to talk about Afghanistan. We have 3 speakers. My theory is the way we'll do this, each of the speakers will make an opening statement of 5 to 7 minutes or so. And then I might have a question or two to kind of get things warmed up, and then we'll have it open to questions from you. If anybody is watching this online and they want to submit questions, they can do it by chat to Becky Rosen or Nikki Boyd, and they'll pass those on to me. So with that, we ready to begin? I just want Afghanistan. We were there for 20 years. We got out just a few weeks ago. And there's so many questions regarding Afghanistan. There's no way we're going to be able to handle that just in our presentation. But I thought we'll hear a little bit about maybe what went right, if anything, what went wrong, probably a lot. What could have been done differently, if anything, what lessons we learned, and what we need to be concerned about going forward. So I don't know what our speakers are going to address specifically, but I'm sure they'll touch on a lot of those things, and I'm sure those will be questions that the rest of you have. We're going to start off tonight with Kirk White. Kirk's official title is a new one, the Assistant Vice President for Strategic Partnerships, and IU Bloomington's inaugural Vice Provost for International External Relations. Kirk retired as a Field Artillery Officer. Colonel White retired as a Field Artillery Officer from the Indian National Guard in 2020 after 30 years of service, including 3 overseas deployments. So with that, Kirk, Colonel White, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. It's really a pleasure to be back here at SPIA. One thing Paul didn't mention, that I was in your seats in the early 80s when SPIA was still in its young days. And congratulations for considering this major. It's done well for a lot of us. You'll find SPIA graduates all over the world now doing great things. And when we say service for the greater good, that's exactly what many of us are trying to dedicate our lives to. And we learned a lot of those principles here, at least I did, in this building. So it's a pleasure to be back with you this evening.
And Kirk's daughter was also a former civic leader. So
She was. She graduated in 2020 in that class that didn't get to have commencement, unfortunately. And she's now a kindergarten teacher here in Bloomington and starting her 2nd year of teaching. And so I thank you for reminding me of that, Paul. Reagan enjoyed her year at Briscoe as a civic leader, certainly. Well, I'm here to talk a little bit tonight about my perspective as an Army officer serving in Afghanistan. As Professor Humphrey mentioned, I did 2 deployments, 2 one-year deployments to Afghanistan. And as I look back on it, we've got to stop and think that many of you, most of you probably weren't born when the 2001 attacks occurred. And that was, as you've learned over this past couple of weeks, as you've watched the news and seen a lot of video accounts, that was a pivotal point for our country. It was the most significant attack on our homeland since Pearl Harbor, which occurred 60 years before. So it was truly the Pearl Harbor of our generation. So if you can imagine that day on September 11th, thinking about how our country, who we thought was pretty well protected by the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans from foreign attack, basically got attacked by terrorist forces in an attack that we just simply couldn't have imagined how that could happen that day. That's what was the shocking part. And so then there was this immediate response from the United States about finding out who did this and going after it. And that's where we kind of lead up to where my deployment occurred. The United States, through its resolve, was in a mission to find the Al-Qaeda terrorists where they had trained. We knew that the Taliban were running Afghanistan at the time, allowed them to have space in their country to do the training that they did to plan the attacks. And so by the end of November of 2001, just 3 months, less than 3 months from the attacks, we had entered the country and removed the Taliban government. The last of the Taliban left in airplanes for Pakistan on around November 25th from Kunduz province up in the northern part of the country. So that was 2001 in November. So then we went about asking the questions, what do we do for the rest of this period of time in getting Afghanistan to be a safe and stable place and a government entity, a people that could enjoy some level of government and plotting their own future besides being governed by the Taliban. At the time I arrived in 2004, our assignment was to take a team of 16 United States Army officers, non-commissioned officers, some of them your ages, and serve as advisors and coaches, trainers, mentors to the new Afghanistan National Army. So we deployed to the northern part of the country. It just happened to be Kunduz, where 3 years before the Taliban had their last stand. And what I found was a country that was embracing its new army. There was great hope at that time. It was a hopeful time for the Afghan people, 2004, 2005. And in October of 2004, the country elected Hamid Karzai, their first freely elected president that they had elected in their history. And there were new things happening. Infrastructure was being built. The schools were open again. Highways were being reconstructed. Little girls could go to school. Women were in universities. Women were teaching. All of this great amounts of international aid pouring into the country. Hospitals being built. The financial system being built. It was a country that didn't have much of that before. There weren't things like cell towers and ATMs and all those kinds of things. All that stuff was being built. It was a time of great hope, as I said. We completed our mission, 16 of us from Indiana. We were part of a much larger unit, of course, of a couple of thousand soldiers from the Indiana National Guard that were scattered throughout the country working with the same kind of mission. We came back, we redeployed, and had lots of good support from our family and friends. And when I was next called to active duty in 2009, we went back. My next mission was to command 3 bases in Kabul and provide force protection for many of our operations in the Kabul area. And what struck me when I got back was what had changed in 5 years. And the problem was there were many improvements. A lot of those things that I mentioned before were getting built, and there was still some hope. But the big difference was the security situation had deteriorated significantly. All international forces, wherever we were operating in the country, were under great stress and under threat of constant attack. There wasn't much of anything we could do without worrying about whether we were going to be attacked or be blown up by an IED. Much different than when it was 5 years prior. And the other thing that I noticed was the same problems that we were having 5 years earlier in structuring the new Afghan army and police and security forces. We had the same problems 5 years later. We should have started to see that the model we were using wasn't working. We were importing a lot of our own ways of doing things, the Western way of doing things, the Western way of security, the Western way of military, the Western way of running logistics and defense. It didn't fit with the Afghan culture. And they simply could not embrace the kinds of things that we expected them to do. On top of that, you have to remember that this was a country that really didn't have a taxing system. So the way we look at ways that we fund our defense, they didn't have that. And so to fund local security operations, you would have a more or less a toll booth at the entrance to different provinces and towns. The police chiefs, men would collect toll. The tolls would get collected. There'd be money skimmed off here or there, and finally, some of it would get back into a security force. But at the time, much of this security of the Army was being completely funded by international contributions, mostly by the United States. And so we realized this culture was just not one that we were used to working with. And that was a fatal error on the part of the United States. It was very difficult for us to transfer our values and way of organizing things to theirs. We always talked about making Afghan solutions to Afghan problems, but we never really understood Afghan culture well enough. That's a problem that people in the United States have. We don't understand other cultures very well. We don't understand our own culture very well right now in our own country at the moment, let alone other cultures. So this was a problem that I noticed in 2010. And so we probably should have looked at things then and started to realize, why are we here and why have we deviated from this mission of getting rid of Al-Qaeda, folks that were responsible for the initial attacks, and why have we clicked over to a mission of some kind of nation building? And could that work for us? And it wasn't working. And someone should have called time out. But because of a lot of the political changes, international pressures and things like that, things that our faculty colleagues tonight know much more about than I do, it just didn't work well. So let's speed forward to where we are today. We left the country. When we left, when we realized we had to leave, yes, that Sunday, a few weeks ago, when I was sitting in church here in Bloomington and the phone dinged, and I looked down at the news brief, and it was from BBC saying Ashraf Ghani, president of Afghanistan, has fled the country. I sunk back in my seat and I thought, it is done. It is over. And the question that us veterans now are faced with is, was all of the sacrifice worth it? No one's going to tell me that what I dedicated 2 years of my life for was not worth it. I simply am not going to go down that road. It was worth it. It was worth it to different levels, but we did our mission that our country asked us to do at that time, and we did it to the best of our ability. That's all you can ask of your military forces. And I saw things happening in that country that made me proud every day, even though there were disappointments. In 2004, for the first time, I could see young girls walking down the road safely on their way to school. They couldn't do that before. And that struck me because at that time, my little girls were the same age as the ones that were walking to school for the first time. Many other advancements. In the 2 years that I was there, and many friendships that I made. And I understood that the Afghan people truly wanted peace. They were just like me. They wanted to live in a country that was peaceful and prosperous, and they longed for it because they'd been living in 30 years of civil war of different kinds and occupations. The Soviets were there and others. And all they wanted was a peaceful way to go about their life. And we gave them 20 years of a relatively free government that they could select on their own. It had its problems, but they had a parliament. They had a freely elected president. People could do things that they couldn't ever do before. So maybe we planted the seeds in those 20 years that will sprout a little bit over the next year, because we gave them a taste of what it could be in a country that was freer than they had experienced before. So I feel good about what we did. We gave them a little bit of what the best we could do. And now it's up to them to take it from here. It may be a difficult road. It may not be what we envisioned, but we did the best we could while we were there. Get ready for questions.
Thank you, Kirk. Appreciate that. Appreciate the perspective. Next panelist is Sammy Desai. Professor Desai is head of, I'll let her say more about her background, but she's director of the Manufacturing Policy Institute. She's been on the O'Neill faculty since 2010, specializes in entrepreneurship, competitiveness, economic development, and has looked at that in the context of Afghanistan and other developing countries. So, Professor Desai.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to preface this with saying I have no answers, only questions, but I hope that I can suggest good questions to be thinking about. And I'll share a little bit with you about what I'm watching. I want to echo some of the comments you just heard, but particularly the one about Afghan solutions for Afghan problems, and just really stressing the importance of us thinking in terms of context and also regional conditions. So when I think about Afghanistan, when I look at things like regulatory reforms, business environment, I compare those to Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, the UAE, Turkey, China, and trading partners. And I don't compare them to the United States or Canada. And so that's one thing that I just want to start off with. And then I also want to echo two things. One is a working system of public administration, starting from a broken system, is a really tough mountain to climb. And the second is the role of corruption in the economy is pervasive and deeply embedded. So any transaction that you're thinking about, think about the inefficiency that corruption introduces, and think about that hurdle across really all aspects of life. And so what I want to talk about in particular is the role of women in the economy. And so we did see a lot of elections. And if you even do a simple search online, you find quite a bit talking about the role of women starting businesses, support for women starting businesses, and a vital role in the economy. I want to share two things that I find particularly compelling. So one is that in 2017, the World Bank shared some information about a microgrant scheme that the Ministry of Labor was piloting. And they had more than 55,000, I wrote it down, I can't remember numbers, well, sorry, 17,000 youth that submitted plans. They selected about 2,500. And about a third of the participants in that pilot were submitted. So that's quite something. And then the second thing is a more recent report in December 2020 that was put out by Afghanistan Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry basically showed that a majority of businesses in 2015 and 2020 were young, were under 5 years old, between 1 and 5 years old. And it actually tells us their conclusion is what I'm sharing, which is that despite the changes in the security environment, the change in development systems and the departure of Navy military forces, women were starting businesses and we're still working and we're still making it happen. So that's really the context that I'm thinking about. The other thing is when women start businesses anywhere, Afghanistan included, the United States as well, they're creating jobs. So a lot of people might think about or make the assumption that women starting businesses in a place like Afghanistan really means that the woman is self-employed and that's really right. That's actually not the case. So, and again, I wrote this down. So that same report from the Afghanistan Women's Chamber found that registered businesses created more than 72,000 jobs, of which more than 17,000. So women are creating jobs for men and women. And then among unregistered businesses, so those are businesses that don't necessarily have a permit or a license, they created more than 56,000 jobs. And over 13,000 of those are women. So women really are playing a vital role in the and that's something that we really need to watch. So a couple of things. 5 challenges have been identified, and these are pretty consistent with other countries And so again, in many ways, these challenges hold everywhere and more difficult in a place that is here like Afghanistan. The first one is lack of access to standard market, right? And so when we think about how women participate in the economy, we want to think about questions as basic as, can you get to a market? Is it secure enough? Is it safe enough for you to, for example, sell your product in a particular place? And so that's one big question. Another is access to capital. That's basically a worldwide challenge. And so what we want to think about is, can you open a bank account? Does the law protect you? Are the steps the same that a man would have to take to open a bank? Can you get a loan? I believe there's a slide maybe that's been emailed to everybody. Okay, great. But are there differences for men and women in terms of how much they can inherit, whether sons and daughters can inherit assets from their family? So these household and family level social structure type constraints really affect the way that women access the economy and can participate for that. The third one is lack of infrastructure. And so it's a really basic question. Can you get things like electricity? Can you get an electric account? And can you access roads? Are the roads safe? Right? So, and then the fourth and fifth are access to business events and access to trade. So one thing to really watch and also pay attention to is how women are accessing things like business education, technical training, and business services. You're in particular. So a recent survey of the Afghan people, it was 4 years ago, showed that about 3 in 4 people felt that women should be allowed to work. So public opinion really matters in the types of laws and types of protections that we have. You might be surprised when you look at that list of legal protections and compare it to other countries by the areas in which Afghanistan does protect. And so there is quite a bit to work off of, and what we really want to pay attention to is the implementation. So a couple of questions to leave you. The first one is, will the laws protect? The second is, how will these laws compare to protections in other countries? Some of Afghanistan's biggest trading partners, China, Turkey, Pakistan, UAE, also have their own laws and standards. So how will these match, and will there be real economic engagement for women? How far will protections go? Will women be allowed to open a bank account, but maybe not get an export permit without a cosigner? I don't know what it's going to look like. And then how will implementation work? And so this is one thing that I really want to emphasize, again, related to the first presentation, which is, even though we have laws, right, in any country, there is often an implementation. And so how things are actually created and how things are actually implemented in practice are two very different questions. And so from a jobs perspective, right, even if we have businesses that are starting, that are hiring, that are growing, that are exporting, right now, we need to be keeping our eye on what types of protections evolve, and also if these protections continue to be enforced.
Thank you, Sammy. Our final panelist is Sumit Ganguly. Sumit is a distinguished professor of political science here at Indiana University. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's got all sorts of background in Southeast Asia, India, Indian politics, and knows a lot about this part of the world. Sumit, observation. Apologize we started without you, but indicated that there were a lot of questions of what went right, what went wrong, lessons learned, and what happens next. So anything you want to tell me?
Right. Well, thanks very much, Paul, for having me on this panel, and my apologies for losing my way from the business school to here. Both of my colleagues have very correctly emphasized the developmental aspects of the American experience in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. And there's no question about it that the US made a good faith effort to transform Afghanistan and to provide a certain level of economic development. Now there will be all manner of analyses that will follow of why that did not succeed and why the Ghani government collapsed like a house of cards. within a matter of weeks once we made a decision to withdraw our troops. In fact, I direct you to a very good editorial this morning in the New York Times by Paris Stockman, who is a member of their editorial board, which provides a really scathing account of the mistakes that were made, many of which Vice President Kirk very correctly outlined in his presentation. What I'm going to do is going to talk about the regional context, because Afghanistan doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists along with three other important countries that are extremely close to Afghanistan. And how are they reacting and what are their interests in Afghanistan moving forward? The first I'll talk about is China. The Chinese can barely contain their view at our departure. Basically, this means a dramatic reduction of American influence in the region, no American military footprint in the region. The closest thing are our bases in Qatar, which are several hundred miles away from Afghanistan, and from where President Biden hopes to carry out over-the-horizon attacks against Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group, should they again emerge in Afghanistan. But basically, there is no American footprint. Bagram Air Force Base now is a skeleton. And consequently, the Chinese are gleeful because we are no longer at their doorstep. Second, it enables them now to consider the possibilities of extracting copper and lithium. And lithium is very important. All of you have one of these. Your batteries are made out of lithium. Lithium is a rare earth, which exists in considerable quantity in Afghanistan. The Chinese are salivating at the prospect of extracting these. Now, of course, that salivation may be a bit premature because we don't know what chaos Afghanistan could descend into. So if you want to run those mines, you want at least a minimum level of stability. So let's see what happens. Third, the Chinese are also delighted from a strategic standpoint because their principal competitor in the region is India. And India had a very substantial presence in Afghanistan, which I will talk about in a moment. But India has another rival called Pakistan, which is right next to Afghanistan and shares a vital border called the Durand Line. It's D-U-R-A-N-D, named after a man called Sir Mortimer Durand, who was a British colonial administrator who drew the line between Afghanistan and Pakistan in the 19th century when the British were the dominant power in South Asia. China will now collude with Pakistan to limit any possible Indian influence. So again, that for them is another win. What about Pakistan? Pakistan is back as the kingmaker. Pakistan was one of the three countries, along with Saudi Arabia, that had recognized the Taliban regime when it was in office from 1996 to 2001. Pakistan has successfully managed already to place key individuals who will do Pakistan's bidding for the most part. And to my abject horror, after 20 years of this war and a considerable sacrifice in terms of blood and treasure, the interior minister of Afghanistan, who had been living in Pakistan, a man called Sirajuddin Haqqani, who was one of the most influential members of a terrorist organization called the Haqqani Network, is the Minister of Interior in Afghanistan right now. And he is, by the way, which places us in a very awkward position if we are to have any dealings with the Taliban regime. He is also on what's called the FTO list, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. And you have to work hard to get on the FTO list. And Haqqani worked very hard. He killed hundreds of people. There's direct blood on his hands. In fact, blood dripping from his hands. Second, for Pakistan, this is an end to India's footprint. The Indians did not particularly like the first Taliban regime because the Taliban were harboring terrorists who were attacking various parts of India. And in fact, in 1999, a set of Pakistani terrorists seized the Indian aircraft, flew it to Kandahar, and the Taliban let the hijackers go scot-free. So those memories continue to haunt the Indians. The only downside for Pakistan at the moment is the possibility of refugees fleeing once again into Pakistan. But so far, Pakistan has basically tightly sealed its borders and have even shelled refugees trying to flee into Pakistan. Only a trickle have managed to get in through legal entry points. Let me talk about India. India is clearly the biggest user in the American withdrawal. The biggest fear the Indians have is the return of terrorist sanctuaries, as happened between 1996 and 2001. The Taliban are making all the right noises, saying they're not going to allow terrorists to once again have a haven here. I wouldn't believe that for 1 second. India had invested $3 billion in developmental assistance, and this was widely considered to be one of the most effective forms of developmental assistance. India helped rebuild the power grid of Afghanistan, helped build cell phone towers, provided high-protein biscuits at lunchtime to Afghan school children. So it was a very targeted form of assistance. Now, of course, this assistance was made possible because of the American presence. Without the American security on ground, the Indians wouldn't have been able to do anything because a handful of their engineers were actually killed by the Taliban. Their embassy was attacked by the Haqqani network. And it's only because of the American military presence that it was possible to have such a successful developmental program. What can the Indians do? Very little. They have very little covert action capabilities in Afghanistan. And secondly, in a related vein, there was something called the Northern Alliance in a region called the Panjshir Valley in northern Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the Northern Alliance last week collapsed. And the Indians had supported the Northern Alliance during the Soviet occupation and had a very good relationship with the Northern Alliance, which is opposed to the Taliban regime. But with the collapse of the Northern Alliance, the one strategic asset that the Indians possess is now gone. The only hope the Indians have of influencing events in Afghanistan is the following. They can withhold assistance. And since they are a regional power, have considerable cultural knowledge of Afghanistan, have long-standing links with us, organic links with Afghanistan, because Afghans for centuries have traveled to India for education, for trade, and have even settled in various parts of India. In New Delhi, thanks to the Civil War, the quality of the cuisine dramatically improved because any number of Afghans opened restaurants in New Delhi, the capital of India. So there are organic links with Afghanistan and considerable sort of warmth for Indians amongst ordinary Afghans, not the Taliban. And consequently, the Indians are hoping to tell the Taliban, look, if you are going to provide terrorist sanctuaries once again, if you are going to adopt a hostile stance towards us, if you are only going to work with Pakistan and China, forget the assistance that we provide. We built your parliament building, one of the finest hospitals in Kabul, the Indira Gandhi Women's Hospital, was funded by the Indians. Any number of young Afghans got scholarships to study in India. Afghan bureaucrats were being trained in India. All this has now come to a grinding halt. The poor Afghan students, many of them of your age, are now stranded in India, and many of them unable to even call their parents on a cell phone because cell phone service, for the most part, has collapsed. So if there's any element of common sense on the part of the Taliban, which I have my serious doubts. But the fact is that the US is withholding $10 billion of Afghan funds in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The US has stopped all World Bank assistance and IMF assistance because we are the biggest kids on the block and we can block that assistance as a consequence. So Afghanistan's coffers are empty. You can only withdraw $200 at a time from an ATM. And that's assuming that you find a working ATM. That's how dire things are. Their currency, the Afghani, has collapsed for all practical purposes. I was watching the BBC the other day and I noticed money changers happily taking Afghanis for dollars at a totally usurious rate. So, given that Afghanistan developmental challenges are going to be absolutely dire, this is the one point of leverage that the Indians do have, and I suspect they will use against the Taliban regime. But beyond that, the Indians, I'm afraid, have lost their 20 years worth of investment in them.
Thank you, Sumit. A lot of questions raised by all three of the panelists as to what goes on next, but let's take questions from the audience.
Make sure you speak up so that our folks that are listening on the Zoom can hear you. That goes for the panelists and the students in the audience.
Any questions?
Hi, I'm Quinn. I'm a law enforcement officer from Indiana. And my question is, considering that in the years leading up to our withdrawal, the Taliban still held a considerable amount of territory within Afghanistan, and how quickly the Afghanistan army laid down their arms. This is after 20 years of trillions of dollars. Was there ever a good exit strategy for us to take, or was Afghanistan essentially, was that government we helped prop up essentially destined to crumble the second time left?
Is there ever a good exit strategy?
I can start with it. Please start. Well, I look at it from a military perspective. And people ask, why did the Afghan National Army collapse like that? Why did they run for cover? Why did they, and some people say, melt into the public? We were at a point, I think, where the Afghan security forces were not being supported well by the money that we were sending to support. Many of them were not being paid on time. We weren't, the Afghan military was not providing food for them. This whole business of corruption is permeated the country, particularly, I imagine, in the last couple of years. It probably got worse because many Afghan leaders at all levels probably saw the end coming and were siphoning off even more money than they had before. When I got there in 2004, and I was mentoring an Afghan infantry battalion, that's 500 soldiers of this new Afghan army. The way we managed that was I would go down to Kabul and I would collect the entire payroll for the Afghan army soldiers, all 500. I put the payroll in my backpack in Afghan currency. And I would drive back up to Kunduz. We'd line up the troops, and the United States was directly, my officers were directly paying the Afghan army soldiers. Because we knew at that point they just didn't have the systems to do it. And we were concerned about the corruption. So at that point, we knew where the money was getting into the hands of the soldiers. What I also did at that time was I was feeding. So when I moved that battalion into a different, or a company, which 120 soldiers. We moved to a different Afghan city. I'd go down to the local restaurants, and I had a backpack full of Afghan currency, and I would go to the restaurant manager and say, I'm going to be here for a few days with my 120 soldiers. I need 3 meals a day. How much is it going to cost? I reach into my backpack and I pay the Afghan restaurant. We got away from that, and the further the United States pulled away from managing that, the less control we had. And it went back to the business of how the Afghans were going to run. And I think in the end, the level of corruption and the distrust that the Afghan soldiers had in their own leaders that lead them caused the army to collapse. As soldiers, you can do almost the unthinkable when you have complete faith in your leaders. Humans can do things you didn't think you could do. I did when I was a younger soldier. But it was because I had confidence in the entire chain of command, from the sergeant I reported to when I was a private, all the way to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I knew they were all good people that were going to take care of me and never leave me behind. We never got that culture in the Afghan army, and I think that's what I lost.
Sammy, Sumit, anything? Could we have done anything differently in terms of getting out, or should we have stayed?
I don't think we should have stayed. The number of people have made the argument that we could have kept a small force to protect people leaving. I think once the decision had been reached by Zalek Khalilzad, whom I happen to know fairly well, in fact, for over 30 years now, who was the principal negotiator. Once Khalilzad at Doha had told the Taliban we would leave by a certain date, if we had extended our stay and kept a contingent of troops, they would immediately have become targets for the Taliban. Make no mistake, these people are utterly useless, and they would have attacked those troops, and they would have expended more blood. So staying on really was not an option. And the comparisons that people make with South Korea and West Germany are fundamentally flawed. West Germany was a functioning society before World War II. Germany was a functioning society. Afghanistan had seen nothing but civil war for decades. Even when Afghanistan had a functioning government, its rate never ran much beyond the borders of Kabul to begin with. And in South Korea, we had to not only fight a major war against an adversary, but we still maintained troops there in significant numbers. And I don't think the American public has the stomach to maintain troops indefinitely in Afghanistan.
One thing the Taliban used to say, you may have heard this, the Americans have all the watches, but we've got all the time. They were just going to wait us out. They had the time. We had all the fancy watches, but they had the time.
Look for more questions.
With all the issues that you mentioned and all the countries that are interested in Afghanistan and maybe like whatever interest they have in Taliban, do you think the Taliban would be sustainable, and what do you think to make it sustainable and possible?
So you're asking, will the Taliban government be sustainable? So, any sense? They're dealing with their own extreme groups like ISIS-K. They've got others that are resisting them, I assume. What's your sense? Is the Taliban staying power, and particularly with the other pressures that we've talked about?
There are differences amongst the Taliban. Amongst other things, the press reports have suggested that while the Taliban are making certain claims in terms of, Kabul itself, we let girls go to school as long as they're segregated. We let women work, but under particular conditions. But the reports are also emerging that outside of Kabul, the Taliban don't seem to be able to enforce any of this. And they have also said that we will not kill or harm those who work with Americans. So that's fallen apart. So it's not entirely clear that the Taliban are a completely cohesive organization. And above all, the thing that I would underscore the most is they are faced with, it was one thing to run an insurgency. Now they are in government. They're the ones that still have to organize garbage collection. They're the ones that still have to run banks. At the moment, Kabul, Hamid Karzai Airport is non-functional for the most part because there's no one to run the radar. It's one thing, any goat can pick up a Kalashnikov. I have one. I picked up one and fired it. And I'm a goat. But it's quite another to have a functioning government. The Turks have said they might run Hamid Karzai Airport, but that hasn't happened yet. Planes are landing only during the daytime because at nighttime you need radar, and there is nobody to run the radar. And these medieval geniuses wouldn't know, what button to press or what lever to pull.
Sammy, you talked a lot about the economic impact that women have had, and to tie into this question, it sounds like the Taliban would be smart to work with these women entrepreneurs who have built some things up as a way to keep society functioning. Is there, you think that's, I don't know, is there a chance of that, or what should the women be doing in terms of the Taliban?
I don't. I think, look, anyone would be smart to work with entrepreneurs. That sort of goes without saying. I think what we're going to end up seeing is, I suspect that again, hypothesizing in my part that a lot of this will come down to corruption and the ability to actually run an economy and the need. So if there is pressure, right, then women entrepreneurs are potentially part of the solution. But it really depends. And I think some of this also, what Sumit was saying, garbage collection, right? Administering schools, creating a taxation system so that you can pay for infrastructure. Those are all things that require good planning, but also a good base of civil service, public administrators, but then also a system that you can free from corruption. And to the extent that the Taliban can do that, right, that will make an impact on how things will work. But I don't know what kind of anti-corruption plan is in place. I would suspect maybe none. But that really, I think, is going to be what affects whether or not even the best intentioned government will.
Take another question. A bunch of hands before.
Hi, my name is Don Chidi. I'm a law and public policy major from Sumit, Indiana. And in Mr. White's talk in the beginning, one thing I picked up was we left the seeds in the people. So I was wondering if any of you predict more of a grassroots effort, maybe something we've seen the Arab Spring movement that could happen in Afghanistan, or if we just didn't leave enough of an impact or something like that.
So possibility of grassroots efforts after our funding was there.
I think there are, I've got to be hopeful that there are. Professor Ganguly mentioned last remnants of the Northern Alliance. We were, if it wasn't for the Northern Alliance, we wouldn't have been able to move as quickly as getting rid of the Taliban. Before we were allied with the Northern Alliance at that time. You've got to hope, got to have hope that there are enough people who will look at this in months or years time. You know, we were doing pretty well when we didn't have the Taliban telling us what to do. The problem with it is as Sumit mentioned, this is not a unified country. They speak over 30 different languages in Afghanistan. It's a very tribal country, and the tribal areas through the different provinces will kind of set up their own structures to manage things, to provide judge and jury for violators, to manage all forms of society. And so having some sort of unified uprising that's big enough to overcome the Taliban is going to be a huge challenge, but we have to have some hope that we gave them a good taste of what could be.
So for another question.
My name is John. And as you just said, that the Taliban now runs the government, but Afghanistan, as they've been for years and decades, it's tribal. You know, Indianapolis, I'm from Indianapolis. You know, if you ask me where I'm from, I stand from Indianapolis, it's actually the west side, the east side, the north side. It does, you don't tell the people that. My question to you is it actually possible for the Taliban to unite this country, and is it reliable? And if that's not the case, what happens to the people when it breaks down? You know, you talk about women in the economic system. Before, women couldn't go to school, they couldn't own businesses, and they didn't very lot of rights. So what happens as the system either slowly breaks or slowly builds up?
Basically, what happens if the Taliban don't succeed in unifying the country?
Afghanistan returns to a state of civil war once again.
Yes.
Very tragic, but entirely possible. It's a colossal tragedy. And I feel this in particular because, Stefan, I mean, he spent 2 years of his life along with thousands and thousands of Americans who took it upon themselves to try and transform this country and to leave it in a better place than we departed. And I agree with him that the seeds are there, because if the seeds were not there, you would not see women demonstrating in public, who are taking considerable risks with their lives to go demonstrate against the Taliban. I don't think I would demonstrate against the Taliban. And these women have demonstrated an extraordinary level of courage in facing these goons in the streets of Kabul. So I'd like to remain hopeful that our investments have not been completely lost, but I fear the onset of civil war.
We do one last question. We're running low on time, and we try to cut these off at the hour mark. What's the one lesson that we should learn from this? Oh, okay. I was going to do the question.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead. I'll do the student question. Sure.
So my name is Josh Brinkman from Carmel, Indiana, majoring in law and public policy. So my question is, with all the military equipment that we left in Afghanistan, the north of $8 billion worth of equipment, plus the possibility of China and Russia selling further equipment to the Taliban, what is it going to look like on the world stage in terms of further terrorism or Taliban aggression?
Well, I think, yes, we left probably millions of equipment there, worth of equipment. We got to remember that, we turned all that stuff over to the Afghan National Army so that they could provide security for their country. So we had the gates open. They've got thousands of Humvees, thousands of artillery pieces, thousands of small arms, mortar pieces, all kinds of things. Now, in those last couple of weeks before we pulled the last pin and got out of there, we were grabbing stuff right and left and trying not to leave. We weren't we never really turned over the most sensitive stuff to the Afghans to manage because we knew that it could eventually fall into the wrong hands. So this isn't a huge problem, but it is still a problem because even at the basic level, a standard tactical radio that we would have given the Afghans in a Humvee. The Chinese, as Professor Ganguly mentioned earlier, are salivating about a lot of things, but they're also salivating about getting up their hands on individual pieces of equipment that they can reverse engineer. And for example, see how we encrypt and decrypt communications back and forth. They don't have the keys to all of it, but they're going to have pieces that a treasure trove of stuff that can get turned over to them and they can take apart. And that's not a good situation to be.
I'm still gonna get my,
Well, I will say that there were a lot of brave Afghan pilots who flew out of the country in that last day or two to Uzbekistan and other places. We saw satellite images of fighter planes that we sold the Afghans. They got in and flew them out because they knew, number one, it was a way to get out of the country. Number two, it was a way to keep this stuff out of the hands of the Taliban. The downside is they left their families behind at great peril because now they're considered a traitor by the Taliban, and I would fear that their families would be tortured and killed for that kind of malfeasance in the Taliban.
I don't know if it's possible to give a short answer, but any quick lessons that we should learn as a country from this 20-year experience? I'll bring Sammy.
Yeah, I mean, so one of them, we did see a lot of really promising change. Like, women were participating in the economy, not just women, but particularly, starting businesses, creating jobs, participating in supply chain, exporting, growing industry, and also opening new markets. And so, I think one lesson is we probably didn't tap the real and raw economic power of women to the extent that could have been done. And, but we still saw it flourish in many ways. So that's, we make the assumption often that during times of conflict, the economy comes to a grinding halt, but that's not actually the case. It's just how we channel it and really help it to walk.
So the 20 years of experience may have still some long-lasting effects that are positive.
I think in terms of economic development work, we've seen some signs that what can work, and so it's really up to what to be pushing in the future to into that.
Sumit, one lesson we can learn from this, or anyone.
I just published a piece with a friend from Singapore on arguing against the notion that the US can't do counterinsurgency. We did wonderful counterinsurgency in the Philippines. We tend to forget that late 1940s, early 1950s, when we helped President Magsaysay of the Philippines beat back a communist rebellion called the Huks, the Hak rebellion. How did we do it? The difference between Afghanistan and the Philippines was, A, we had an understanding of Filipino culture, number one, and two, Magsaysay's government had popular legitimacy. And I'm not sure that either Karzai or Ghani ever acquired that kind of widespread legitimacy. And so if we ever go in again into another country, we have to ensure that the people we are supporting are perceived to be popular and legitimate by the vast majority of the population. In the absence of that, no amount of dedication on the part of the military can produce a different outcome.
I'd say two things that Professor Ganguly made the first point. That is, we're getting ready to work with another country. When you are our diplomats and you are our bureaucrats working in government or our military leaders, the first thing you have to do is understand the culture where you're going to be working. You have to do that. That's why each of you have such a unique opportunity while you are here at Indiana University to learn, to pick a couple of cultures, parts of the world, and dive into how their history, their religion, their politics, their culture. I know you've got a lot on your plates. I did when I was an undergraduate, and the thought of trying to learn about Central Asia was something beyond my comprehension at that time. But the tools are here for it. We teach over 70 languages here. And when we did go into Afghanistan, guess who DOD and DOS called? They called Indiana University because we were one of the only places in the country that was still teaching Dari and Pashto, the two prominent languages in Afghanistan. They called us to help them, and we did. So know that culture. Heck, even if you're going to take a vacation to Africa, learn the culture first. Okay. Second, know the mission that you want to accomplish before you go. Know what the end state is and stick to it. Our problem was the mission kept changing over the 20 years. We first started out to get rid of Al-Qaeda. Then it was other parts of Afghanistan we could fix. And then it would turn into nation. And from one year to the next, we weren't sure what the mission was. And we didn't know where the end state was, what the final outcome should be. We weren't really sure about that at some points either.
Great panel, round of applause. For our mentioned for the students, the civic leaders, Colby Wicker is going to be doing a debrief tomorrow on this at 6 o'clock. If any of you want to talk further about some of these issues, and make sure you sign out so we've got your attendance. Okay.